In today's video, we're going to be slowly going step by step towards creating this particular looping pendulum animation. We're trying to make it a satisfying animation, and I want to make sure that everybody is able to understand all of the concepts while building this. We will be using constraints as well as geometry nodes and many other techniques here and there, which you can apply in various other animations as well. So all in all, I hope this will be a useful tutorial for everybody who's learning Blender, and with that, let's actually begin the tutorial. The first thing that we want to do in our default scene is actually create the base pendulum that will be swinging around. To create that, we will use geometry nodes, so let's bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and then change this from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to add in a new geometry node tree, after which we will zoom in and select the group input and tap X to delete it. Now, we essentially want to add in a circle, and we will try and fill in the circle up to a certain amount, which will act like the thickness of the ring. If we fill it in completely, it should become a solid disk. So to do that, we'll press Shift A and search for a mesh circle, and then we'll plug this mesh circle into the group output. Now, if we actually zoom into the mesh circle, you can see that the edges are clearly seen, so we need to make this a lot smoother. For that, we can increase the number of vertices from 132 all the way to 256 to make it nice and smooth. Now that we have this really smooth circle, we can figure out how to fill it. So to fill it, we'll press Shift A and search for the extrude mesh node and plug that in after the mesh circle. Now, since we don't have any faces, we actually need to extrude the edges inward. So we're going to change this from faces to edges, and then we can just play around with this offset scale into a negative value to make this actually start filling the ring and converting it to a disk. Now, if we had the radius as something like 2 meters, you'd see that we have to change this offset scale all the way to a value of -2 to make it completely get filled. So therefore, this radius is going to control how much we need to play around with this offset scale. For now, I'll keep the radius at 1 and the offset scale at -1 itself to create the disk. Now, although we have a disk, it has no thickness. So the next thing that we need to do is actually give this some thickness. So to give it some thickness, we can press Shift A and search for another extrude mesh node. Now this extrude mesh is actually going to extrude the faces, so we need to make sure that it's kept at faces itself. Now, if we actually look at it, there's all these tiny bands that are created. We don't want that. So instead of individual, we're going to switch it off. That way, we just have this sort of a shape where it's been extruded down just like that. Now, of course, this does not fix our issue because we currently have a hollow cylinder. The top face is not present at all. So to actually add in that top face, we'll press Shift A and search for a join geometry and then join it in with the original mesh that we had, which was this. So let's take this and plug that in right there. And now we have the top face as well. And we also have a bottom face. Now the problem with this is that we have the shading set to smooth, and that's why we can't see this edge and it doesn't look good at all. So to fix that for the time being, we'll press Shift A and search for a set shade smooth node. We'll plug that in right here and we'll switch off the shade smooth. And that way you can clearly see the shape that we have. Now, when we generally offset it like this and cause these extrusions, we often need to actually rotate the faces or flip them so that the normals are pointed outward. So we'll actually take a look at flipping the faces when we add in the bevel modifier. So let's start off by adding the bevel modifier, which is supposed to make the edges nice and smooth. So we'll go to our modifiers and then search for the bevel modifier, and then we can just start increasing the number of segments to make it nice and smooth. So you can see that down here, we do get a nice bevel and it seems to be working. But on top, we don't get any bevel at all. And that's because these are two completely separate geometries. To make them one, we have to select our geometry node modifier again to bring our geometry node tree here. And then after the join geometry, press Shift A and search for a merge by distance. Now once this merges into one single object, the bevel will start appearing. But as you see, the bevel is clearly not working as we want it, and that is because the normals are flipped. So let's press Shift A and search for a flip faces node, and this will help us rotate the faces in the opposite direction, which will make the normals face correctly and the bevel also work correctly. So now we can see that we have really nice beveling occurring. Maybe the amount is a bit too strong, so let's change that to 0.02, and then the number of segments can be 5 itself, and that's actually good enough. Now we don't need these lines to be seen, so let's make it set to shade smooth. So let's just select this set shade smooth node, press Shift D and plug it in after the merge by distance. Now we have to check shade smooth, and that way we'll get a nice smooth looking cylinder that's present over here. But right now, if we actually take a look at this, the origin, which is going to act as the pivot point for any rotations or whatever, is present up here. We actually want this to be present right at the center of this object. So what we can do is we can move the entire object up by half the actual distance. So for that, we'll press Shift A and search for a set position node and plug that in after the set shade smooth. Now we can change the offset on the Z value until it comes to the center. We know that this length is equal to the amount it was extruded by over here, and since we extruded it by 1 meter, we're going to go ahead and move it on the Z-axis by half of that, which is going to be 0.5 meters. And that way, the pivot point comes perfectly to the center. Now we need to set the material for this as well. So let's press Shift A, search for set material, and then plug that in right after the set position. For the material, we'll just select the default material because we haven't used that for anything else yet. Now the actual animation of this entire thing opening and closing will be created using this original extrude mesh node. If we reduce this offset scale from -1 down towards 0, we're going to have it open, and as we bring it back to -1, it's going to close up again. And because we have the merge by distance, when it reaches -1, that little point at the center will also be merged, and we won't get any divots caused by the bevel modifier. So that works absolutely fine. Now we can actually start creating the pendulum motion for it. So for that, let's go ahead and first rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Then we are going to use a technique that we've used multiple times on this channel before. And in case you want to see how to create another type of pendulum, definitely check out this video right here. But in this video, we'll go ahead and press Shift A and search for an empty and choose the plane axis. Then we'll press G, Z, and we'll move it up by maybe 5 units, and accordingly select this particular cylinder, Shift select the empty and press Ctrl P and choose Set Parent to Object. So now if you select the empty and rotate it about the x-axis, you'll have the entire pendulum type swinging motion, so you can go ahead and animate this. Before we start animating, we'll set all of our output defaults by going to our output properties, changing the frame rate to something like 30 frames per second. And if we keep it at 30 frames per second, we can change the end frame to 150 to make it a 5-second long animation. Then the output folder will choose whichever folder we want. / will store it in the same folder that your blend file is saved in. So remember, you should save the blend file by pressing Ctrl S. Then your file format, I'm going to choose FFmpeg video so that I get a video as the output. And the encoding, I'm going to change the container to MPEG-4 and an output quality of perceptually lossless. This is up to you, but I find these settings to be good enough for the animations that I create, and it takes up fairly less space on my device. After that, we'll expand this timeline by a little bit and we'll press the back arrow to go to frame 0. Then with just the empty selected, we'll press RX followed by something like -45 to move it up to about this distance. Then we'll tap I and choose rotation. Then on frame 75, which is halfway through the animation, we'll rotate it on the x-axis by a total of 90 units, which will make it go 45 degrees in the opposite direction. Then we'll press I and choose rotation, and then we can select the original keyframe over here, press Shift D to duplicate it, and then move it all the way to frame 150. So now when you play the animation, this is what we get, and this is exactly what I'll be using. The default is directly kept to Bezier, which means it's going to actually slow down when it reaches these keyframes and speed up in the middle. But because this is a pendulum, that motion actually aids to the animation, so I'm going to leave it at Bezier itself. Now the next thing that we need is some sort of object around which this pendulum bob will actually pass through. So let's press Shift A and search for a mesh UV sphere, or we can use an icosphere. It's really up to you. Maybe I'll use an icosphere, but before I do anything, I'll expand this little drop down over here and increase the number of subdivisions all the way to 5 to make it really nice and smooth. To make it even smoother, we'll go to Object and choose Set Shade Smooth. Now that we have this created, this object has to pass through this. So while it goes through this, the first thing is that it has to actually expand in its size, and to make it look natural, it should also shrink on one of the axes. So we're going to do that using an object constraint, which is present in the constraint properties over here. So let's go to the constraint properties with this object selected and choose Add Object Constraint. Then we'll go ahead and choose the Maintain Volume, which is present under the Transform constraints. Now we need to choose a free axis, which is going to determine how this actually changes its shape. If we just press S and move it, you can see with the y-axis, that isn't the axis that we wanted to move on. So let's change the free axis to the z-axis, and the owner is going to be the local space. So that is the local z-axis for this particular cylinder. And that way, when we now press S, you can see how it squishes and changes based on that particular axis. So this is the exact motion that we want, and we actually want this to go in like that as it crosses this particular sphere. So in the animation, you can see that by around frame 20, it should start expanding, and it should stay expanded till about 20 frames before the other edge. So on frame 20, let's go ahead and select this and press I and choose Scale. Then on frame, let's say 35, it should become completely expanded, or maybe frame 30 itself, it should reach its maximum size. So let's now scale it down so that it actually increases in the height and width. And let's go with a value of 0.4 and then tap I, Scale. Now we know that 20 frames before the end is when it should again reach its original size. So the end is at 75. So let's go 20 frames before that, which is frame 55. So here, let's go ahead and press Alt S and tap I, Scale. And then 20 frames from this, which is frame 75, we'll again press I, Scale. Now 10 frames before this is the amount of time it should take for this to go from the maximum size to the smaller size. So that's frame 45. So let's take this particular keyframe at frame 30 and press Shift D to duplicate it and move it till frame 45. So now when we play the animation, this is the animation that we have, which looks absolutely perfect. But of course, we need the same thing to happen when it comes back, because right now it expands while going, but it doesn't while coming back. So to do that, let's go ahead and duplicate this keyframe as well all the way to frame 0, and then select all of these keyframes, press Shift D to create a duplicate, and then move it till the first frame matches up with frame 75. So that way, we should get something like this, and this keyframe becomes redundant. So let's just select it and tap X and choose Delete Keyframes. So now when we play the animation, it expands, it goes till the other edge, it expands again, and that looks absolutely great. Now, this is just one level of animation. You can add in even more variations as well, such as another layer of rotations. So maybe to show you one scenario like that, we'll go to frame 0, we'll take this, we'll go to the actual object properties and play around with this Z rotation over here. Let's make it 90 degrees, and then to add in a keyframe just for the Z rotation, you can press this little dot over here. Now let's say once it actually reaches the other end, it should go to the opposite 90 degrees. So that means it should go to minus 90, which means it moved by a total of 180 degrees. Then to add in the keyframe, just press this little diamond property button that has been created. So now from 0 to 75, you can see how the motion happens, and you can have it go back all the way to minus 90 on the other side or plus 90 on the other side, by just duplicating that first keyframe and moving it all the way to frame 150. Or you can always go ahead and make it finish the entire rotation by making this, instead of minus 90 to plus 90, we can make it go from minus 90 over here to plus 270. So let's actually change this to minus 270 and then add in this particular keyframe by just clicking that again. And now you can see it actually stays here. It rotates and then it rotates the entire round and comes back over there. Now it's really up to you how you want to do this animation. And in my case, I'm actually going to make it go in one direction and do the entire turn and come back. So that means here it'll seem like it's not symmetric about the axes, but I think that doesn't really matter in my case. Now, another thing that you might see is that in this situation, it's actually fairly straightforward when crossing this region, but when it's coming back, it's actually more tilted, which means it might intersect with the sphere. So if you want to change the timing in which it's doing the rotation, you can actually expand this, switch it from the timeline to the actual graph editor and play around with the graphs. So let's select this object and go to the object transforms, and we want to do the Z rotation. So let's just hide the scale over here and see just the Z rotation. Now, if you can't quite see it, you can use your control middle mouse button to either zoom out or zoom in. The x-axis is controlled by moving your mouse right and left, and the y-axis is by pressing control and moving it up and down with the middle mouse button. If that doesn't work for you, you can always use these scroll wheels. If you click the absolute edge and move it down, you'll actually be zooming in, and moving it away actually zooms out. You can do the same thing for the horizontal axis as well by pressing these buttons. Now we're going to go ahead and play around with the actual scale of these to determine how the rotation happens. And if I want to play around with the scale of these individually, I want to go here and change this to the individual centers. That way I can just select everything and scale them up and scale them down accordingly to get different graphs. So I think in my case, I'll actually scale it up by a value of 1.5, and maybe this central one I can actually scale down to make it a bit smoother. So maybe this I'll scale down to maybe 0.5 after scaling it up by 1.5. So now let's see what it looks like, and I think that looks fair enough. But again, I might change these just before actually rendering, because even here I feel like, yeah, now it's actually worse than it was before. So let's go ahead and play around by scaling this down, and you can see how it actually changes the amount it's rotated by. Maybe let's select these and just scale these down as well. See how it plays out and things like that. So maybe this is good enough. I guess I had to scale all of them down, and that looks like a much better animation. Now we need to animate the property where this actually opens up. So let's change this from the graph editor back to the timeline. Let's bring this down and then go into the geometry node window. In the geometry node window, again, we had to animate this extrude mesh property. So let's go to frame 0, and for the offset scale, let's go ahead and tap I. Then let's say it should start opening by frame 20. So on frame 20, we'll go ahead and tap I, and then on frame 30, or let's say 35, it should open fully. So on frame 35, we'll change this offset scale to something like maybe 0.2, and of course it has to be minus 0.2, and then tap enter, and I think that's big enough. So let's go ahead and tap I, and now we're going to use the same technique that we used while creating the actual scaling. So let's just bring our cursor to this edge, and you see there's this little arrow mark. You can click it to expand this side panel. Then you can press this to expand the summary, and we want to deal with the geometry nodes keyframes. So let's expand geometry nodes, and you see you have the default value of the extrude mesh. So again, we saw 20 frames from the absolute extreme is when it starts to open. So the absolute extreme is frame 75. So on frame 75, we'll make this -1 and we'll tap I. We'll go 20 frames before that. So frame 55, we'll make this offset scale as -1 itself, and we'll tap I. Then it took 15 frames for it to open fully. So from 55, we'll subtract 15 frames. So about frame 40 is where it should start closing in again. So over here, we'll just take this completely open value, press Shift D to duplicate it, move it till there, and now we have the entire animation where it even opens up as well. Now again, it's not happening in this section where it's coming back. So let's just select all of these nodes or keyframes and press Shift D, bring it over to the side, and then go ahead and remove this redundant keyframe that's been created. So tap X and delete keyframes. So now we have this particular animation. You have to make sure that you don't accidentally delete any of the rotational keyframes. So let's just Control Z. Let's press Shift D and just redo this section and select these, press Shift D, bring it out over here. Now let's just select this, X, and delete keyframes. So now it should work properly. And this is what we have, which is absolutely perfect. So that's the base for this particular section. Now you can make this as complex as you want. One method of making this complex is adding in another pendulum, and this time using delta transforms. So let's go ahead and select both this empty as well as this pendulum by Shift and selecting them. And then we can press Shift D to create another duplicate. Now with the second empty selected, we can go to the object properties and expand the delta transforms. So these delta transforms will allow us to change any of these properties without having to add in more keyframes. So I simply want all of the keyframes to remain exactly as they are, but I want this to also be rotated about the Z-axis. So all I'll do is change the rotation on the Z in the delta transforms to maybe 90 degrees. So that way we'll have one happening absolutely perpendicular to the first one. Now I think this is good enough, but the problem is that it's clearly intersecting with itself. So to prevent it from intersecting with itself, I want to actually change the delta transforms for the scaling as well. So I'll just select it, and then I'll go ahead and then change the scale to something a bit smaller so that it makes this object fit through it. So let's see, right about here, we can change this to maybe 0.45 is big enough to get the entire thing through. So now we can go ahead and play the animation, and this is what it looks like. And I think that looks fine. We have to make sure that there's still no intersection. So you can see there's an intersection over there. And to prevent those intersections, we might have to play around with the way the actual rotation occurs. So let's select this, go back to our graph editor, then again, just play around with the Z rotation. Let's hide all the other keyframes. And this time maybe we'll have it go in one direction and come back up. So let's delete these keyframes by selecting them, tapping X and choosing delete keyframes. Here on frame 0, maybe for the Z rotation, we'll change it to 0 and we'll tap I. Then on frame maybe 150, we'll change the Z rotation to 0 itself and tap I. Or we'll just press this again. It's fine. Then on frame 75, we'll go ahead and maybe rotate it by 180 degrees. So here we'll say 180 and we'll tap I, and let's just see how that rotation works. So evidently that rotation didn't work out too well, and we're going to have to change that. So I'll play around with this rotation quite a bit till I get something that actually works. Now you could try and use math to figure out what values would work the best, but for the time being, I think I'm just going to try out doing this manually by using different keyframe values. Another option that you have is having this just rotate after it crosses this particular object once. So maybe till about frame 30, you can keep the rotation at 0 itself, and then between frame 30 to about, again, 30 frames before 75, so that would mean frame 45, you can keep it absolutely as is, or on frame 70, you can go ahead and rotate it by a total of 90 degrees, or maybe again you can go this extreme plus 30. So on frame 100, you can go ahead and rotate it. Instead of 90 degrees, let's go with 180 degrees and then just add in a keyframe. So that way, when you play the animation, you should have it about straight till there. Then it comes and it does the rotation. And once it's completed with the rotation, it stops rotating as it passes by again. So it's really up to you as to seeing which one actually works and which one doesn't. But essentially for now, I'll just keep it like this and I'll play around with it a bit just before rendering. Once you're happy with the way the animation looks, you can go ahead and set up your camera. So let's select the camera, press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, and then we can go ahead and press R X90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Then we'll press GY to just move it back a bit, and then we'll press Shift A and search for an empty. You can choose whichever empty you want. For now, I'll just use a cube and I'll scale it up so that it's easier for me to see. Then I'll select the camera, shift select the empty and press Ctrl P and choose Set Parent to Object. That way, when I press 0 on my numpad to go into the camera view, I can just select the empty and change the empty's properties such as the scale to zoom in and out, or I can rotate it, and apart from that, I can always just grab it and move it around as well, and the camera will follow along. But for now, I'm not going to move it. Instead, I'm only going to be scaling it and rotating it to make sure that these pendulums that I just created always remain absolutely within the center of my frame. So you can use the local axes as well if you feel like that's going to be beneficial. But for the time being, I think I'll just press Alt R again, followed by RX, and I'll just move it up, and then I'll press RZ and I'll just bring it to some area like that. Now I want this rendered region to actually be square, so I'll go to my output properties and change these resolutions from 19201080 to just 1080 into 1080. Now when I play the animation, everything should fit within my camera scene. If it's not, again with the cube selected itself, I'll just zoom in until the animation is nicely fitting just within my camera screen and taking up most of the space. Once I have some settings set just like that, I can go ahead and select the camera, go to the camera properties, and go down to the viewport display, increase the passport to all the way to 1, expand the composition guide, and just switch on center just to make sure that it still is at the center. Now I'll switch off my overlays and start off with the actual materials. For the materials, the first thing that I want to do is add in a plane. So I'll press Shift A, Mesh, Plane, and I'll scale it up to a very high amount. Then I'll press GZ and I'll just bring it down till it doesn't interact with any of the objects present in the scene. So at around this region, I can just move it till it comes below that pendulum, just like that. Now that I have that set up, I can go ahead and switch over to the viewport shading of rendered so that I can see the changes that I make. Then I'll go to my render properties, switch on bloom as well as screen space reflections, and under screen space reflections, I'll switch on refraction as well. Now I'll go ahead and select any of my geometry node objects, and I'll switch from this geometry node editor to the shader editor. Now essentially for these, I want them to be glass, so I'll select the principal to be SDF and tap X to delete it. Then I'll press Shift A and search for a glass BSDF, and I'll plug that into the surface. Now for the actual glass material, to be able to see through the glass, you need to make sure that screen space reflections are switched on for the object as well. So let's go to the material properties, change the blend mode from opaque to something like alpha hashed or alpha blend. In my case, I'll use alpha blend, and then I'll change the shadow mode to alpha hashed, and I'll switch off show backface and I'll switch on screen space refractions. So that way you'll actually be able to see through the glass and it'll interact with this sphere and things like that. As you can see, it is being refracted through the glass and you can see it. But I don't want the glass to have no roughness at all, so I'll increase the roughness to something like 0.3, and that should be good enough. Now to give it some tint, maybe I'll go with a bluish tint just like that, and that will be good enough for the glass. Of course, I could have both of them be different colors. I could go and have different things added in, such as some textures, some noise, or some displacement, but I think this will be good for my animation. If you want to know how to add in different materials for these two objects, you have to note that you can't do that without changing the geometry node section. So you'll have to select one of them, switch over to the geometry node editor, and actually duplicate this particular node tree by pressing this button so that it becomes its own user. Then over here in the actual set material, you'll have to change the material. So in the material properties, you have to go ahead and remove this material press this new button to add in a new material and then select that from here. So that way you'll be able to make changes to whatever other object you have. But again, for now, I'll just use the same material itself. Next, for the sphere, I'll select it. I'll go back to the material properties and I'll add in a new material. And then if you can't see the nodes, just press period on your numpad to centralize the nodes. And maybe this one, I'll make it a diffused BSDF. So I'll select the principled BSDF and tap X to delete it. Then I'll press Shift A, search for a diffuse BSDF and plug that into the surface. For the color, I'll go with the opposite of the blue, so maybe a reddish color. So let's just select the color and bring it down like that. I'll increase the saturation to maybe 0.6 and I'll change the value all the way to 1. Then I'll select the base floor plane, I'll press new and I'll make this very reflective. So in the principled BSDF itself, I'll make the metallic all the way to 1 and the roughness I'll reduce it to maybe 0.2. Now the problem with having refraction switched on to these objects is that screen space reflections do not occur for objects that have refraction switched on for their materials. So over here you can see we switched on screen space refractions and that's why they can't be seen. If we switch this off in the reflections, you might be able to see it based on what your settings are. But as long as you have screen space refraction switched on, you'll see that the reflections do not come in the 3D viewport. So right now screen space refractions are off, the reflection is present. If I just switch on screen space reflections, then the reflection is not there. So you have to figure out how to do that. Now the way I'm going to do that is by using a reflection plane. So let's change the blend mode to alpha blend itself, and then I'll press Shift A and search for a light probe and there choose the reflection plane. Now to see the reflection plane, I'll just switch my overlays back on and you can see it's present right there. I don't want it to be there, I want it to be just above this plane. So I'll press G, Z and I'll move it till it just intersects with the plane. So somewhere like that. And then I'll press S to just scale it up. So now all of these regions come within the reflection and you should be able to see reflections. Now, if you don't see reflections, make sure that you play around with the height of the reflection plane. So let's just select it and press GZ to move it up. And right about there, you can see there is some reflections occurring. So you have to make sure that the placement is absolutely perfect. So now all the reflections are present and this looks much better. Next, I can give this plane some texture. So again, with the plane selected, let's go ahead and play around with the base color. I'll press Shift A and search for a Voronoi texture and I'll plug that into the base color. Then to get more control, I'll press Shift A and search for a color ramp and I'll plug that in right between the Voronoi texture and the base color. Instead of the color, I'll actually use the distance so that we can get nice spheres. Now I don't want them to be spheres, I want them to be dots. So let's increase the scale up to something like 150 and then let's just drag this black in and the white in just like that till they become dots. So now again you can change the size of the dots by moving this black even further behind the white and that way the dots will be much smaller. If you want more dots, just increase the scale from 150 to something even higher. Let's go with 250 and now you can see there are even more dots. I want them to be a bit bigger, so I'll just drag this in and that looks fine for me. Now I'll go to my actual world properties and I'll change this background color all the way to white so that we get a much brighter animation. Now for this object as well, maybe the central one, I'll go ahead and increase the roughness from 0 to something like 0.5 and I think that just looks a bit better, although it's not that noticeable. Now for the plain background material, I do want there to be some nice waves that move away. So I'll press Shift A and search for a wave texture. And again, with the Node Wrangler enabled, I'll select it and press Ctrl T. To enable Node Wrangler, you'll have to go to your Edit, Preferences, then go to the Add-ons tabs and search for Node Wrangler and make sure it's checked. With this present, you can change this texture coordinate from generated to object. And then again, just like last time, you can take a color ramp node by pressing Shift A and searching for the color ramp so that you get some more control and plugging the color into the factor and then plugging the output color through a bump node into the normal. So let's press Shift A and search for a bump node so that we can convert the color data into normal data, and then just plug this in right here. We'll reduce the strength to maybe 0.1 and then take the normal and plug it into the normal of the principled BSDF. Apart from that, you'll see that the scale is actually a bit too large. So let's go ahead and increase the scale so that the waves can be seen. Now the waves are present in this direction. That's not the direction that I want. So I'll change this from bands to rings, and I'll change the axis from X to the Z axis. Or if you're not sure which axis you want the rings to be around, you can choose spherical so that it works on any of the axes. But since I know it's the Z axis, I'll change it to the Z axis. Now to actually make the waves look like they're going outward over time, you can go ahead and change the phase offset. So on frame 0, I'll hover over the phase offset and I'll tap I. And then on frame 150, I have to change the phase offset to any even multiple of pi. So I can say 2 star pi, 4 star pi, or 6 star pi. And maybe for this tutorial, I'll go with 4 star pi so that it finishes 2 full loops in one single loop of the animation. So I'll hover over this and I'll tap I. Then with the wave texture selected, the keyframes should appear down here. I'll have to press T and linear to make sure that it's a smooth loop. Now the waves are going inward. So instead of doing plus 4 star pi, I should have done minus 4 star pi. So let's go back here. And for this phase offset, I can just select it, add in a minus at the end, and then tap I. So that way I should have these waves moving outward just like that. And I think that is good enough. To get some more reflections and everything nice, you can add in more lights. So you could use this light itself, or you can press Shift A and search for a light and choose maybe the area lights. And now again, GZ to bring it up, and go to the light properties over here. I'll increase the power to maybe 1000 watts, and I'll just rotate it a bit. And to see it, you can switch on your overlays again. Press 0 to go out of your camera view. And now you can scale it on different axes to just make the shape of the light much better and more unique. That way the reflections on these different materials will also look better, and it'll just give a whole other realistic vibe. But make sure that you don't go overboard with the lights as well. And you just have to place as many as you feel is necessary. So I'm going to actually speed up this process because it's really up to you and your scene and what you think looks the best. And I might actually, make a few changes just before I hit the render button. So for now, this is what I have and it looks good enough. But I want to add in even more objects within this scene to make it look even better. So let's press Shift A and just search for a mesh UV sphere. I'll press Ctrl 2 to give it a subdivision surface of level 2, and you can't see it because it's present just behind this sphere. You can press G followed by Shift Z to move it on everything but the Z axis, and then you can place it wherever you want. So maybe I'll place one on this corner of the screen. Maybe I'll press Shift D and move one to this corner of the screen, and make sure you press Shift Z so that it doesn't move up and down. Then let's select these and press Shift D and move them to the top of the screen. Now remember, even this, although it's fine just like this, you might actually want it to have no depth value to make this look more satisfying. To actually remove the depth value from the screen, you can give it an orthographic look. So for that, you'll have to select the camera, and you can do that by switching on overlays and just pressing the outline of the camera over here. And if you're unable to do that, you can go back to the empty that has the camera within it. You'll be able to see the camera icon here. Expand this and then select the camera. Then in the camera properties, change the type from perspective to orthographic, and that way the depth will no longer be registered. So that just gives it a much flatter look, and I think that looks good as well. And that actually adds to the satisfying element of these videos. Then you can select these spheres again, press Shift D, Shift Z, and just bring them up right about there. And again, maybe all of these I can move them a bit lower. So I'll select them, press GZ, bring them down. And again, G, Shift Z, just place them wherever you think is suitable. You can add in even more spheres by duplicating these, scaling those down, placing them wherever you want. You can give each of these their own materials. and you can just play around with all of these until you get something that you think looks good for your scene. But that's essentially all there is to creating this, and once you're happy with the way everything looks, you can go ahead and press Render Animation. I hope I went slow enough in this video, and I'm actually not going to edit it the way that I generally edit it to remove all of those gaps and areas where I mess up my speech and things like that. So I'm sure this is a much longer tutorial, and if you actually stuck through it, congratulations, I guess, and thank you so much for watching. The fact is that there were many small things here and there that are used that'll help in various other animations as well. So I think it's worth watching, but I'm pretty sure most people would be skipping through that. My average view duration on any given video is generally ranging between 1 to 2 minutes at most, and I try to remove as many gaps as possible, and I try to make it fast paced so that everybody gets information as fast as possible, because that's generally how I prefer my tutorials, or at least how I prefer to watch tutorials on YouTube. However, I feel like many of you think my tutorials are a bit too fast and you want me to slow down and explain things a bit more. So this was an attempt at trying to give one slow tutorial for people that would benefit from it. Hopefully this really helped those people, and until the next video comes out tomorrow, thank you so much for watching, keep creating, and don't forget to stay creative.